Hello everyone. Tonight, we're diving into the scandalous side of the sacred, the bizarre, uncomfortable world where sexuality wasn't private at all, but public, divine, and occasionally terrifying. From priestesses, declared wives of the gods but locked away in cloisters, to queens forced to marry their brothers for the sake of cosmic order, to entire communities staging fertility rituals so public they'd make modern festivals look tame. Sexuality, in ancient tribes, was equal parts holy, grotesque, and politically dangerous. So take a moment if you like this kind of strange journey through forgotten history. Hit subscribe or leave a like, but only if you actually enjoy hanging out here in the shadows of the past. And I'd love to know, where are you watching from, and what time is it for you right now? Share it in the comments. I always find it fascinating how these stories travel across time zones and screens. Now, lower the lights, maybe pour yourself some tea, or let the hum of a fan fill the room. Settle in. We're about to slip quietly into the forbidden chambers and sacred festivals of the ancient world, where scandal and sanctity were often the same thing. Let me tell you about the person you could have been. Not the one scrolling through feeds in sweatpants, but the one whose body was considered public property the moment you reached puberty. Imagine being told your hips don't belong to you, they belong to the gods, to the harvest, to the balance of the cosmos, and, by extension, to every nosy elder in the village. Suddenly, your private life is less romantic strolls by the river and more committee meeting about where your thighs should be on festival day. That's the thing about sexuality in ancient societies. It was never just you and whoever you fancied sneaking glances across the fire. No, it was ritual, spectacle, statecraft, and occasionally a community theater production with more chanting than foreplay. For us moderns, sex scandals involve Instagram leaks and reality TV. Back then, the scandal was that everyone knew and approved. Nothing was whispered, it was sung, inscribed, carved into temple walls, and possibly supervised by a priest with very specific ideas about cucumber placement. Take a step back and realize, in many early cultures, fertility wasn't just personal, it was economic. If the rains came late or the crops failed, people looked to ritual unions, sacred priestesses, and cosmic marriages to reset the order of things. Your body wasn't yours, it was basically insurance for the barley crop. Imagine if the modern food supply chain depended on your bedroom performance. That's pressure. And here's the delicious irony. What later empires, and especially colonizers, branded as decadent rites were, at the time, considered holy, sacred even. People genuinely believed sexuality was the bridge between human fragility and divine abundance. You weren't misbehaving, you were holding the universe together, one awkward ritual at a time. But let's not sugarcoat it. This blending of divine duty and bodily obligation created endless contradictions. Priestesses who were supposed to embody chastity were sometimes also symbols of divine fertility. Queens who were meant to secure bloodlines ended up marrying cousins, uncles, or their own brothers, all in the name of purity. And in the process, sexuality became the most scandalous, open secret of tribal and early state life, because it was never about desire. It was about power, politics, and whether the gods had enough grain storage lined up for winter. So, let's put it simply. If you had been born into one of these ancient tribes, your body would have been stamped with a kind of divine logo before you even had a crush. Every choice or lack of choice would ripple outward as sacred duty, political stability, or cosmic embarrassment. And the fact that future historians would later call it scandal only adds to the joke. Because what looked shocking to outsiders was, for insiders, just another Tuesday in the sacred calendar. And since Tuesday isn't over yet, let's walk from this premise into the actual stage where scandal began. The temples, where sexuality wasn't private sign but choreographed ritual, and the priestesses carried the weight of divinity on their backs, sometimes literally. So, here you are, stepping into the temple, the place where holiness and scandal share the same incense burner. Forget the idea of temples as quiet halls for private prayers. In Mesopotamia, for instance, temples were the beating heart of everything: banking, food storage, politics, and yes, sexuality. It wasn't whispered about behind curtains. It was structured, scheduled, and supervised. Take the Intu priestess of Uruk, dedicated to Inanni, the goddess of love, war, and, let's be blunt, complicated bedroom politics. Her role wasn't just lighting candles or humming hymns. She was central to the sacred marriage rite, where the king symbolically united with her to reenact the divine union between Inanna and her lover Dumuzi. This wasn't for kicks. The belief was simple. If their ritual union went well, crops flourished, animals multiplied, and the city thrived. If it didn't, well, you can imagine the awkward silence when everyone's barley field looked suspiciously barren. Now, modern scholars argue endlessly about how physical these rites really were. Some think it was full-on performance. Others say it was more symbolic, with feasting and recitations standing in for anything too intimate. But either way, the scandal was baked into the structure. Outsiders, like Greek historians, looked at these ceremonies and saw moral chaos. Locals saw divine insurance. So while one man scoffed, "Oh, Babylon is decadent," another man was anxiously wondering, what if the goddess actually notices if we skip the ritual? And here's the kicker. Temples didn't just regulate these grand public unions. They also managed whole classes of women consecrated to the gods, sometimes as celibate keepers of ritual purity, sometimes as women expected to embody fertility through carefully choreographed rites. Some were forbidden to marry, others were symbolically wives of the deity, which in practice meant their sexuality was absorbed into the temple economy. Try explaining that at family dinner. "No, I can't marry your son. I'm already married to the storm god." Yes, he's very demanding. The line between sacred and scandalous was razor thin. For instance, Herodotus claimed that in Babylon, every woman once in her life had to visit the temple of Ishtar and lie with a stranger as a sacred offering. Modern archaeologists have torn that story to shreds. It was probably a misinterpretation, but the fact it stuck tells you something. The Greeks couldn't imagine ritual sexuality as holy, so they branded it prostitution. That word carried forward for centuries, staining how people thought about Mesopotamian women who were, in truth, upholding cosmic balance with their bodies. And you, standing there in linen robes heavy with perfume, wouldn't have thought yourself scandalous. You'd have thought yourself necessary, essential. The wheat depended on you. The gods depended on you. And the entire city waited to see if you could keep order by moving your body in rhythm with the seasons. So no, temples weren't neutral spaces of quiet prayer. They were engines of sexuality turned divine duty, which makes you wonder if this was considered sacred. What happened when queens joined the ritual game? Because outside the temple, in the palace, sexuality became less about crops and more about bloodlines. And that's when things got really complicated. If the temple made sexuality look holy, the palace made it look deeply awkward. Imagine being crowned queen in ancient Egypt or Mesopotamia. You're dressed in gold, smeared with oils that smell like burnt honey, and told, "Congratulations, your body is now a diplomatic treaty." Romantic, isn't it? Because here's the truth. Queens didn't marry for love. They married for politics, stability, and, quite often, genetic proximity that would make any modern doctor faint. Brother, half-brother, uncle, it didn't matter. The closer the blood, the purer the divine line. If you thought your family reunions were tense, try walking into one where half the men are potential husbands and the other half are plotting your replacement. Take ancient Egypt, where sibling marriage among royals was not just tolerated, it was celebrated. The logic went like this. The gods married their siblings looking at you, Isis and Osiris, so human royalty should too. It was cosmic cosplay, and you were the unlucky actor cast in the starring role. And it wasn't optional. Refuse, and you weren't just snubbing your family, you were jeopardizing the divine balance of the Nile itself. People didn't say, "She's reluctant." They said, "The flood will fail." That's the kind of pressure that makes wedding jitters look adorable. Mesopotamian queens had their own version of this burden. Marriage wasn't just about producing heirs. It was about forming alliances across city-states and tribes. Your womb was a contract written in flesh, and once you were married, you weren't free to hide in the women's quarters. Queens were often public figures, choraling leading rituals, signing off on temple offerings. But here's the scandal. If you misstepped, if someone accused you of infidelity, it wasn't just gossip, it was treason. A queen's body wasn't private, it was the state. And adultery meant political betrayal on a cosmic scale. The double standard, of course, was monumental. Kings could keep harems, rows of concubines tucked away behind screens, treated as status symbols. Nobody blinked when a king had children by multiple women. But if a queen even looked at the wrong courtier, people started oiling the execution stakes. Love, for queens, was less about intimacy and more about optics. Your handholding wasn't romance, it was theology. And here's the eerie part. Queens were remembered less for who they were, and more for what they represented. Was she the great royal wife, the divine vessel who bore the air? Or was she the scandal, the dangerous woman whose sexuality threatened dynastic stability? History has left us both portraits, the powerful queens carved in stone, and the whispered rumors of queens who were erased from records because their love life didn't match the script. So if you had been born a queen in one of these palaces, your bed wouldn't have been a private sanctuary. It would have been a throne extension. And your body, like the crown, weighed heavy not with desire, but with expectation. Which brings us to the next step in this scandalous ladder, when those expectations took the shape of ritual itself, and your marriage wasn't just to a king, but to a god. Now imagine this. It's spring in ancient Sumer, the barley's trembling in the fields, and the entire city is waiting for your wedding night. No pressure. You're the high priestess, or perhaps the king, and your marriage isn't just about you. It's about Inanna, goddess of love, and Dumuzi, her shepherd lover. What you're about to do, or at least, isn't intimacy. It's agriculture. This was the sacred marriage rite Hieros, Garamos, one of the most dramatic performances in the Mesopotamian calendar. On the surface, it looked like a divine honeymoon staged in the temple, hymns recited, wine poured, incense thick enough to choke an ox. The king and the high priestess, or sometimes a stand-in, enacted the union of goddess and consort. Symbolically, this sealed the fertility of the land. Barley would grow, sheep would multiply, the city would thrive. If they skipped the ritual, well, nobody wanted to risk a famine because the king wasn't in the mood. Now, the big scholarly debate: how literal was it? Did the king and priestess actually consummate this ritual in a chamber? Or was it more theatrical, a banquet, recitations of love poems, symbolic offerings of dates and beer? Archaeologists lean toward the second option, though erotic hymns to Inanna survive that suggest the ritual had at least a symbolic sensuality. Whatever the case, outsiders saw scandal, insiders saw divine insurance. The crops needed sex, whether physical or poetic. And here's where the absurdity comes in. Your personal life, already public, was now fully pathological. Imagine your boss, your family, and half the neighborhood crowding the temple because your symbolic wedding night was apparently tied to next season's rainfall. It was sexuality stripped of privacy and inflated to cosmic scale. One wrong chant, one fumbled line, and suddenly everyone's muttering that Inanna's displeased and the harvest is doomed. Talk about performance anxiety. For the king, the stakes were just as high. His legitimacy as ruler wasn't based solely on military victories or palace intrigue, was grounded in this ritual union. He had to prove, in front of gods and people alike, that he could embody fertility, cosmic order, and masculine strength. If he failed, whispers spread. Maybe he wasn't chosen. Maybe the gods were reconsidering their investment. And in a world where divine approval kept you alive on the throne, that whisper was deadlier than an assassin's dagger. The irony, of course, is how scandal and sanctity blurred here. What later cultures mocked as ritualized debauchery was, in its own time, sacred theater. A priestess wasn't shamed for participating, she was revered. Her body became the meeting ground of heaven and earth, even if to us moderns it looks suspiciously like politics in lingerie. And you, had you been born into this role, wouldn't have thought of yourself as indecent. You'd have been the pivot point of the cosmos, the hinge between gods and farmers. Your wedding night wasn't yours, but the city's. And if that feels scandalous, wait until we follow this thread to the priestesses, who became not just brides of kings, but brides of gods themselves, women consecrated to divine husbands who never came home, except in ritual. Now picture this: you're told you're a bride. The invitations are carved, the incense is burning, the feast is ready, and your husband is a god. Which sounds impressive until you realize he's not showing up for dinner, ever. Welcome to the life of the consecrated priestess, the eternal spouse of divinity. In Mesopotamia, India, and beyond, women were dedicated as wives of gods. In Babylon, the N2 priestess of Marduk was styled as his consort. In India, the Devadesis were dedicated to temple service, symbolically married to deities. You weren't expected to run a household or scrub the floors. You were expected to embody divine presence with your body. And that's where the scandal creeps in. Because once your sexuality is consecrated, it's no longer yours. It's temple property, wrapped in incense and cosmic bookkeeping. Let's be clear, this wasn't a uniform experience. Some priestesses lived in strict seclusion, forbidden to marry or bear children, their chastity considered essential for cosmic purity. Think of the Babylonian Nadru, locked away in special quarters, their lives reduced to prayers, property management, and a vow that their wombs would remain closed. Others, like the Devadesis, were expected to dance, sing, and embody the fertility of the deity in public performance. Their consecration sometimes made them cultural icons, artists, custodians of sacred music, even advisors to kings. But their sexuality was a gray zone, revered, controlled, and often exploited. Imagine the contradictions. In one city, your sexual life is stripped away entirely, forbidden in the name of purity. In another, your body is woven into ritual festivals, where your dance is a sacred offering. Outsiders, whether Greek chroniclers or Victorian colonizers, saw scandal everywhere. They called it debauchery, prostitution, moral collapse. Locals, meanwhile, insisted it was divine marriage. And in a way, they were both right. When your wedding vows are to a god, you're both elevated and trapped, sacred and scandalous at once. The irony is sharp. These priestesses were central to their societies. They managed temple estates, performed rituals that sustained the crops, and carried divine legitimacy for kings. Yet their reputations have been twisted through millennia of outsider judgment. Sacred wives became scandalous footnotes. Divine brides reduced to exotic rumors in the annals of Herodotus, or in colonial ethnographies that couldn't see past their own prudish lenses. And if you had been one of them, your wedding day would have been the strangest of all, dressed in linen or silk, crowned with flowers, chanting vows to a god you never touched, while everyone around you nodded seriously, as if this was the most normal thing in the world. And maybe it was. Maybe for a moment, you even believed it until the centuries piled up, and someone decided to call your marriage a scandal instead of what it truly was, a contract with the divine. And yet, not all priestesses were locked into this paradox of fertility and chastity. Some were forbidden from sexuality, altogether sealed away, sworn off marriage, their virginity weaponized as a tool of cosmic order. Which leads us, with a sigh, into the strangest scandal of all, when sacred women were consecrated not as wives, but as the world's most untouchable So, what's more scandalous than being told your sexuality belongs to a god, being told it belongs to nobody? Imagine being locked away in a walled quarter of Babylon as a Nadru priestess. You've got wealth, land, servants, even business contracts in your name. But there's one non-negotiable clause in your cosmic job description. You will never marry, never bear children, and never let anyone mistake you for an ordinary woman. Your womb is closed by decree, as if your uterus were suddenly listed as out of service on the divine maintenance board. That's how it worked for the Nadru dedicated to Shamash, the sun god. These women were elite, cloistered, and paradoxically powerful. They managed estates, loaned money, signed contracts, and in many ways operated like an economic class of their own. But their sexuality, off limits. Their role was to radiate purity, untouched by marriage ties that might entangle temple wealth. It was a restriction dressed up as holiness, but in practice it meant their bodies were under constant surveillance, policed, not for scandalous behavior, but for any hint of normal human desire. And they weren't alone. Think of Rome's Vestal virgins, who spent 30 years tending the sacred fire of Vesta. Break your vow of chastity, and you weren't scolded, you were buried alive. Nothing screams high stakes like keeping your legs crossed under penalty of suffocation. Their virginity was considered essential to Rome's survival. If the flame went out, people panicked that the empire itself might collapse. In other words, your body wasn't your own, but the fire insurance policy of the state. The irony: these women were exalted. The Nadru were respected as brides of Shamash. Vestals rode in chariots, sat in seats of honor at games, and had legal privileges Roman women could only dream of. Yet beneath the pomp was the suffocating reality. Their sexuality was erased for everyone else's peace of mind. You were holy precisely because you weren't allowed to be human. Now, imagine yourself in that role. You walk through the temple courtyard, robes gleaming, people bowing. They whisper, "She is sacred," but what they mean is, she is untouchable. Your power comes with a wall, both literal and symbolic. You're respected, yes, but you're also isolated, defined by what you cannot do, cannot feel, cannot express. And if you ever did cross that invisible line, suddenly the society that revered you would turn and punish you in the harshest, most theatrical ways possible. This is the scandal that rarely gets talked about, not ritual sex, but ritual celibacy. Outsiders point at sacred unions and cry decadence, yet the greater cruelty was often directed at women sworn never to touch, never to be touched, their virginity chained to the survival of whole empires. And if that doesn't sound like a scandal, it's only because history has dressed it up in incense and marble. And still, the rumor mill spun the other way. For every cloistered virgin, there were whispered tales of priestesses accused of sacred prostitution, of temples where sexuality supposedly ran wild. Which leads us neatly into the next chapter of this long, uneasy dance, the infamous stories half-truth, half-smear about women who supposedly turned sacred ritual into scandalous commerce. Now here's where scandal and scholarship collide like two ox carts in a narrow alley. You've probably heard the story. In ancient Babylon, every woman, no exceptions, was supposedly required, once in her life, to go sit in the temple of Ishtar, wait for a stranger, and offer herself as a sacred act. Sounds juicy, right? The kind of tale that keeps Victorian gentlemen clutching their Bibles and modern documentaries, sprinkling in ominous flute music. The source, Herodotus. The man loved a good story, even if accuracy occasionally died along the way. Modern historians look at his claim and wince. There's no archaeological evidence that Mesopotamian women lined up for ritual sex shifts like divine baristas. More likely Herodotus misunderstood temple rites that involved offerings, blessings, or symbolic acts of fertility. But the damage was done. From then on, sacred prostitution became the scandalous phrase attached to Near Eastern temples, repeated for centuries as proof of how decadent the East was compared to the supposedly restrained Greeks. Spoiler, the Greeks weren't exactly prudes. That doesn't mean sexuality wasn't present in temples, it absolutely was. Priestesses performed fertility rituals, sang erotic hymns, danced in festivals where divine love was dramatized. Some scholars suggest there may have been ritualized unions between devotees and priestesses to reenact mythic couplings, though again, the evidence is fragmentary and heavily debated. What's certain is that outsiders latched onto the idea of sexual rites and amplified it into scandal, because nothing sells quite like a mix of gods and gossip. Now, put yourself in the sandals of a Babylonian woman listening to these rumors. You know that your neighbor's daughter was dedicated to Ishtar, that she spends her days tending offerings, weaving, managing temple property, not lying in wait for Greek tourists with bad haircuts. And yet, here comes Herodotus, scribbling away about how everyone is scandalously debased. It's the ancient version of tabloid journalism. Scandal sells truth, yawns in the corner. The irony is sharp. While Herodotus painted Mesopotamian women as temple courtesans, back in Greece, entire cities had state-regulated prostitutes, and sacred festivals like the Dionysia featured processions of giant phalluses paraded through the streets. But of course, scandal always tastes better when it's about the other. The Babylonians got saddled with the title of history's supposed inventors of sacred prostitution, a label modern scholars are still trying to peel off like a stubborn sticker. But here's the thing, even if the exact details were distorted, the kernel of truth is that sexuality and ritual were deeply intertwined, not as everyday prostitution, but as cosmic performance, as myth brought to flesh. And once that association stuck, it haunted every priestess, every queen, every temple woman for centuries in the eyes of outsiders. What was sacred within became scandal without. And while the temples bore the brunt of foreign gossip, the palaces weren't exactly innocent either. Because if temple sexuality was seen as ritual excess, royal harems became the symbol of political excess where desire, power, and paranoia collided behind closed doors. So, you thought temples were scandalous? Step into the palace harem where sexuality wasn't about gods anymore. It was about politics, alliances, and keeping one very nervous king both satisfied and terrified. Forget the Hollywood fantasy of silk cushions and idle women feeding grapes. A royal harem was less romance novel, more high-stakes boardroom with eyeliner. Take the pharaohs of Egypt or the great kings of Mesopotamia. They didn't just collect wives because they were greedy or bored. Each marriage was an alliance, a contract carved into flesh. Marry a princess from a rival city, and suddenly you've secured peace, or at least a few years of let's not invade each other, keep multiple wives from noble families, and you've essentially gathered a living insurance policy. If one family rebels, you've still got 3 others tied to your bloodline. Convenient, if a little crowded at family dinners, but here's where the scandal simmers. The harem wasn't a quiet corner of the palace. It was a political engine, dozens, sometimes hundreds of women, each with her own attendants, wealth, and ambitions, all competing for influence. A king's bed wasn't just about affection, it was about access. If you bore a son, you weren't just a mother. You were suddenly a faction leader with a claim to the throne tucked into your cradle. And in a world where succession was rarely neat, that cradle might as well have been a sword. Picture it, gossip swirling through the corridors, servants whispering, mothers plotting. One queen favors her son, another bribes a priest, a third hints that she has the gods on her side. Every glance at the king becomes loaded. Every pregnancy is a potential civil war. And meanwhile, the king, dripping in gold and trying to look divine, knows perfectly well that his greatest threat isn't a foreign army, but the women waiting behind his own palace walls. The irony, of course, is that outsiders loved to portray harems as dens of decadence, orgies behind sandstone walls. The truth was far colder. Harems were prisons gilded with jewelry. Women could be pawns, players, or prisoners, but they were never free. Some wielded enormous power. Think of Egypt's Queen Tide, who advised her husband Amenhotep III and corresponded with foreign rulers. Others disappeared into anonymity, their names erased, their lives reduced to whispers in court records. And you, had you been born into that labyrinth of silk and suspicion, would have quickly learned that the harem wasn't about desire at all. It was about survival. Compliments were daggers wrapped in perfume. Friendships were alliances waiting to collapse. And every night, when the king chose a companion, the real choice was which faction lived to see another sunrise. So while temples staged rituals of divine fertility, harems staged rituals of dynastic anxiety. And if a queen or concubine ever stepped out of line, say, whispered too sweetly to a courtier, the scandal wasn't personal, it was treason. Which leads us, inevitably, to the next chapter in this uneasy tale, when adultery wasn't just a sin of passion, but an act that could topple empires. Now, if you were a queen or a consecrated wife in the ancient world, your love life wasn't measured in blushes and sighs. It was measured in political earthquakes. Because when your body was the state, adultery wasn't a private scandal, it was treason. Take the laws of Mesopotamia. The Code of Hammurabi spells it out, with all the subtlety of a sledgehammer. If a married woman was caught with another man, both could be tied together and drowned in the river. Unless, of course, the husband pardoned her, because naturally, her body was his to pardon. In Assyrian law, things could get even harsher, with mutilation and public shaming added for dramatic effect. Meanwhile, if the husband strayed, let's just say the legal tablets were oddly quiet on that point. Egypt wasn't gentler. Queens carried the double burden of being both wives and symbols of divine legitimacy. If rumors of infidelity spread, it wasn't just palace gossip, it could unravel dynastic order. Think of Ankhesenamun, the widow of Tutankhamun, accused perhaps falsely of plotting marriage outside the royal line. Whether or not she ever touched another man, the idea of adultery was enough to send shockwaves through the court. And then there's the Hittites, who loved a good legal tablet. Their laws made it crystal clear. A queen's adultery was state-level betrayal, punishable by death, while a king's trysts barely merited a raised eyebrow. The double standard wasn't hypocrisy, was systematized inequality. Women's bodies carried legitimacy, men's bodies carried privilege. And if that sounds familiar, it's because some scandals echo across centuries with irritating persistence. Now imagine yourself in that position. You're married to a man twice your age, surrounded by suspicious courtiers, locked in a palace where even a smile in the wrong direction could be interpreted as seduction. One friendly glance at a guard, and suddenly scribes are chiseling rumors onto tablets. The queen has dishonored the realm. You can't win. If you're warm, you're guilty. If you're cold, you're scheming. Your safest option: develop a face of polite neutrality and the emotional range of a brick. The irony is grotesque. Kings maintained harems of wives and concubines numbering in the dozens. But one whispered accusation against the queen, and suddenly the cosmic balance of the kingdom was on trial. Adultery wasn't about desire, it was a weapon, a tool to remove inconvenient women, rewrite succession lines, or fuel palace coups. Scandal didn't just ruin reputations, it redrew history. So yes, adultery in ancient tribes wasn't about stolen kisses, it was about power plays, and the fallout was spectacularly lethal. Which brings us, smoothly, to the next delicious chapter, the forbidden lovers and hidden affairs that slipped through the cracks anyway, leaving behind myths, legends, and sometimes very nervous scribes trying to explain divine bedchamber drama without blaspheming. Because here's the thing, forbid something loudly enough, and people will do it anyway, preferably in a dark corridor where the walls are thick and the scribes aren't looking. Adultery might have been treason, but that never stopped the stories of queens, priestesses, or even gods themselves from sneaking into bed with the wrong partner. And when they did, the scandal didn't just stay in the palace, it got immortalized in myth. Take Egypt. One of the juiciest tales isn't even about a queen, but about the gods Horus and Seth. Their rivalry turned so bitter that, according to myth, Seth tried to dominate Horus sexually as a way of humiliating him and claiming power. The story is grotesque and comic at once. Seth thinks he's won, but Horus, ever the strategist, catches the evidence and throws it away, only for Seth to later be tricked into eating lettuce smeared with Horus's seed. That's right, divine conflict resolved through a scandalous food fight. Try carving that delicately into temple walls. Or take Mesopotamia. The goddess Inanna was notorious in myth for her lovers, especially Dumuzi, the shepherd king. Their relationship wasn't painted as polite marital harmony, it was a storm of passion, betrayal, and ritualized sex hymns that left little to the imagination. Outsiders called it decadent, insiders called it sacred. Either way, the gossip was eternal. The gods themselves modeled the forbidden, and humans took notes. And then there were the human royals. History whispers about queens accused of dalliances with guards, scribes, or priests. The evidence is always murky, sometimes propaganda, sometimes rumor, but the fact that these stories stuck shows how magnetic the scandal was. People wanted to believe that behind the veils and rituals, someone slipped, someone reached for desire instead of duty. And when that happened, the consequences were nuclear. A lover could be executed, a queen erased from records, a dynasty reshaped overnight. The irony, of course, is how often myths and gossip overlapped. What was divine drama for the gods became whispered suspicion for queens. Forbidden love wasn't just dangerous, it was politically useful. If you wanted to bring down a woman in power, accuse her of a secret affair. No one needed proof. The scandal was enough. Now imagine yourself in that role, married to a man you didn't choose, watched by servants who doubled as spies, aware that every word you spoke might echo in a courtroom or a temple tablet. And yet desire doesn't vanish because priests say it should. Maybe you smiled too long at a guard. Maybe you whispered to a priest in the garden. Maybe nothing happened at all, and still the accusation stuck. In that world, a glance was an affair, and an affair was a death sentence. And yet, myths remind us that even gods couldn't resist forbidden intimacy, which tells you something uncomfortable. Scandal wasn't a crack in the system, it was the system. Every prohibition created its shadow, every vow its betrayal. And when the forbidden became public, people didn't call it love, they called it disorder, rebellion, cosmic imbalance. Which is why the next step in this spiral takes us outside the palace walls to the public festivals and fertility rites, where sexuality wasn't hidden at all, but staged in front of everyone like a cosmic theater of desire. So far, we've tiptoed through temples and peeked behind palace walls, but sometimes sexuality wasn't hidden at all. Sometimes it was marched right into the village square, dressed in flowers, painted in ochre, and performed in front of everybody, including your grandmother, your priest, and that neighbor who never minds his own business. Welcome to fertility rites, where intimacy became public theater and scandal was the whole point. Take agricultural festivals. In many tribal and early state societies, the cycle of planting and harvest was paired with rituals of symbolic sex. Crops and wombs were linked, both had to be fertile, both had to perform. And because nobody trusted chance when it came to food, people acted it out. Men and women would sing erotic hymns, mimic intercourse, or ritually marry plows to fields. It wasn't pornography, it was cosmic insurance. And if you thought sneezing during a ritual was embarrassing, imagine trying to bless a cucumber with the whole community watching. In Greece, the Thesmophoria festival celebrated Demeter and Persephone with rituals of fertility and rebirth. Women gathered, exchanged ribald jokes, and carried out secret acts involving pigs and fertility symbols. Outsiders heard about it and whispered scandal. Insiders knew that crops and community health hung on these strange performances. In Rome, the festival of Lupercalia had men running through the streets half naked, whipping women with strips of goat hide to promote fertility. To us, it looks absurd. To them, it was divine foreplay for the land itself. And don't forget the tribal practices outside the Mediterranean. Among some African and Oceanic groups, fertility dances included explicit gestures, chants, and symbolic couplings. It wasn't titillation, it was pedagogy. Young people learned about sex, roles, and reproduction through ritual performance. Desire was reframed as duty, and the spectacle blurred the line between sacred and scandalous. Now imagine yourself in that crowd. You've spent months praying for rain, watching the fields crack under the sun. The festival arrives. Suddenly, the entire community is acting out the union of gods, earth, and humans. People are laughing, shouting, singing lewd songs older than the language you speak. You laugh too, partly from nerves, partly from recognition, because deep down you know the crops matter more than your embarrassment. The irony here is thick. Later historians, and especially missionaries, painted these rituals as indecent, barbaric, scandalous spectacles. But for the communities themselves, they were deadly serious. Public sexuality wasn't shameful, it was survival. And when survival depends on barley sprouting or goats multiplying, you don't leave fertility to chance. You act it out, loudly, publicly, scandalously, until the gods get the message. So yes, there were festivals where sexuality spilled into the streets, woven into song, laughter, and ritual performance. And while outsiders clutched their pearls, insiders clutched their harvest baskets. Which leads us to another contradiction. If public sexuality was sometimes necessary, virginity could also be weaponized as sacred. A woman's untouched body wasn't scandalous, it was political dynamite. So here's the paradox. One moment, sexuality is dragged into the public square and acted out for the gods like cosmic theater. The next, the highest form of holiness is not sex at all, but the absence of it. Virginity became a kind of divine nuclear weapon, invisible, fragile, but powerful enough to make or break empires. Take Rome's Vestal virgins, chosen as little girls. They swore 30 years of chastity in service to Vesta, goddess of the hearth. Sounds innocent until you realize that if one of them broke her vow, she wasn't just shamed, she was buried alive. Imagine being told at age 10 that your sexuality is now directly tied to the stability of Rome, and if you slip, you're going underground literally. Their virginity was thought to guarantee Rome's survival. As long as the sacred flame stayed lit and the Vestals stayed untouched, the city would stand. In other words, your uterus was the firewall of the Republic. Mesopotamia had its own versions. The Nadru priestesses we met earlier were locked in cloisters, forbidden to marry or bear children. Their celibacy wasn't framed as repression, it was framed as purity, as closeness to the divine. Their untouched state kept temple wealth from being diluted by heirs and family politics. In practice, it meant their sexuality was erased, turned into a kind of negative power. They were holy precisely because they weren't allowed to be human. And in India, the paradox appeared in reverse. Some women were consecrated as devoteesses, symbolically married to gods. Their sexuality was absorbed into ritual performance, but their virginity, at least at consecration, marked them as sacred. A body untouched by mortal men was seen as a worthy offering to the divine. The scandal here is subtle. Virginity wasn't about innocence, it was about ownership. The community owned your body through its vows, not you. Now, imagine being one of these women. People bow as you pass. They whisper that you carry the city's fate between your thighs. You sit in honored seats at ceremonies, your robes whiter, your jewelry brighter. Outwardly, you're revered. Inwardly, you're trapped. Every friendly glance, every rumor, every sigh could endanger you. Power and fear fuse into one suffocating crown. Virginity as divine leverage. And here's the irony. Outsiders, from Greek chroniclers to Christian moralists, far from fixated on the festivals, the indecency, the bawdy fertility rites. But the real scandal, if you look closely, was this obsession with enforced purity. Communities built entire systems around the belief that a woman's untouched body was more powerful than any army. That power wasn't freedom, It was surveillance dressed as sanctity. So yes, virginity could elevate you to the highest ranks of the sacred, but it also chained you more tightly than any ritual rope. Which brings us to the next twist in this tangled web, when sexuality didn't just mean purity or fertility, but a bending of the very categories of gender itself, rituals where men became women, women became divine, and scandal looked a lot like transformation. Now, if you thought virginity and fertility were already tangled enough, let's talk about the rites that bent gender itself into something elastic, scandalous, and deeply sacred. Because in many ancient traditions, the gods weren't particularly interested in keeping people in tidy categories of male and female. They wanted transformation, and transformation often looked queer. Take the Galli, the ecstatic priests of the goddess Cybele in Anatolia and later Rome. These men renounced masculinity in the most irreversible way, ritual self-castration. Yes, you heard that right. In a frenzied festival, they cut away the physical sign of maleness, dressed in women's clothing, and lived as devotees who blurred the lines between genders. Outsiders recoiled. Of course, Romans in particular found them both fascinating and unsettling. Yet within the cult, their transformation was power. They embodied the goddess, crossed the human-divine divide, and became living proof that devotion trumped biology. Or look to the native North American traditions, where two-spirit individuals held sacred roles. Their gender variance wasn't considered scandalous locally. It was honored as a sign of balance, of carrying both masculine and feminine energies. Colonizers, predictably, branded it deviant and erased it from records, leaving behind scandal where once there had been reverence. Even in Mesopotamian myths, the goddess Inanna transformed her devotees. In her descent to the underworld, she is described as granting men the roles of women, and women the roles of men because divine presence meant dissolving human categories. To stand near her was to be unmoored, unpinned, scandalized in the eyes of those who clung to fixed rules. And then there's Dionysus, the Greek god of wine, theater, and ecstatic abandon. His rites blurred every boundary. Men dressed as women, women let loose in frenzied dances, and the normal hierarchies of gender, class, and decorum dissolved. Outsiders labeled it madness. Insiders called it liberation. The scandal was the point. To shed the skin of identity and taste, something raw, stranger, and divine. Imagine yourself in one of these rites. You're standing in the crowd, heartbeat in your throat, watching men in flowing dresses whirl through the streets, their faces painted, their bodies trembling. The air is thick with drums, shouting, blood, and wine. You feel your own identity loosen, stretch, melt. For one night, you're not bound by the ordinary laws of family, marriage, or body. And in the morning, when everything returns to normal, you can't quite explain what you saw, only that it unsettled you, maybe even freed you. Here's the irony. What insiders experienced as divine transformation, outsiders catalogued as perversion. The Romans wrote laws banning the Galli from citizenship, branding them as dangerous. Colonial missionaries erased two-spirit traditions by force. Scandal replaced sanctity. Yet the traces remain reminders that gender fluidity was not a modern invention, but a very old way of reaching the sacred. And if virginity had been weaponized, and gender bent into ritual power, you can already hear the clucking of colonial chroniclers. Because when they stumbled onto these rites, they didn't see meaning, they saw immorality. Which leads us straight into the next scandal. How outsiders misread, exaggerated, and rewrote sexuality in tribes to suit their own anxieties. Here's where the real scandal starts. Not in the temples, not in the harems, but in the notebooks of outsiders. Because when Greek historians, Roman moralists, or European missionaries stumbled onto tribal or temple rites, they didn't take notes with curiosity. They took notes with an agenda, and those agendas turned sacred acts into salacious gossip, transforming cultural practices into proof of decadence, savagery, or sin. Take Herodotus, that ancient Greek travel blogger we met earlier. He saw Babylon's rites and claimed every woman had to sell her body once in the temple. Archaeologists still can't find evidence of it, but the rumors stuck for 2,500 years. Why? Because scandal makes for better storytelling than truth. It let the Greeks shake their heads smugly and say, "At least we don't do that," conveniently ignoring their own phallus parades and theater festivals that made Babylon look tame. Fast forward to the colonial era. Missionaries in India encountered the Devadosi system, where women were dedicated to temple service through dance and music. Instead of seeing artistry and devotion, they saw prostitution. The words stuck like tar. Entire traditions were dismantled under moral panic, their nuance flattened into scandal. A system that once gave women social and ritual power was rewritten as corruption, justifying colonial reform and control. Or look to Africa, where fertility dances performed for planting, rain, or initiation were quickly labeled lewd by European chroniclers. Anthropologists of the 19th century wrote endless footnotes about native indecency. While back home, Victorian men were paying for burlesque shows. Scandal is always easier to assign to someone else's culture. Even the Romans, long before European colonizers, did the same. When they imported Cybele's cult into Rome, they tolerated the goddess but sneered at her galley, priests castrated, gender-bending, ecstatic. The rituals were reframed as barbaric excess, even as Rome relied on the cult to stabilize its own wars. Outsiders loved to enjoy the spectacle while declaring it immoral. Now imagine yourself as one of those insiders, standing in a sacred dance, chanting hymns that your ancestors have sung for centuries. You know the rite is for fertility, for balance, for the gods, and then a man with a scroll shows up, scribbles a few lines, and centuries later your ritual is famous not as sacred, but as scandal. Your devotion becomes someone else's proof of your primitiveness. That's the real theft, not just of land or wealth, but of meaning. The irony, of course, is that these colonial and classical misreadings shaped how we still talk about ancient sexuality today. What was once sacred got frozen in time as taboo, forbidden, or scandalous. And yet, beneath the distortions, the truth hums on. Sexuality wasn't a side note of ancient ritual life, it was the stage itself, which leaves us with one final turn. How these scandals reimagined and rewritten left a legacy that still clings to the memory of priestesses, queens, and rites long gone. So here we are at the end of the trail, looking back at all those priestesses, queens, and rites wrapped in incense and rumor. And what's their legacy? Mostly scandal. Not because their lives were scandalous, but because later generations decided to remember them that way. Think about it. The women who danced fertility into the soil were rewritten as prostitutes. The queens who married brothers to secure dynastic survival were remembered as depraved. The priests who bent gender for the gods were filed under freakish whole systems of sacred sexuality were reduced to gossip footnotes, while the nuance, the survival logic, the ritual order, the sheer weight of cosmic duty was quietly erased. What remains is scandal because scandal is sticky. Holiness, after all, is boring to record. The irony is sharp. These women were often the backbone of their societies, keeping crops growing, dynasties stable, rituals alive. They weren't marginal, they were central. Yet history remembers them not as pillars, but as curiosities. They became moral cautionary tales for outsiders, whispered anecdotes in temples and textbooks. Their power shrunk to scandal, because scandal is easier to retell. And here's the cruel joke. Their reputations have outlived their actual temples, their songs, their laws. The priestesses of Babylon are remembered less for the estates they managed than for Herodotus's gossip. The Devadasis are remembered less for centuries of music and art than for colonial accusations of immorality. The Vestals are remembered less for legal privileges than for the threat of being buried alive if they ever looked twice at a man. The story was always rewritten through the lens of scandal. Now picture yourself in their place. You've lived a life of duty, 1 foot in the human world and 1 foot in the divine. You've been revered, feared, and scrutinized. And centuries later, strangers still can't decide whether to call you holy or shameful. Your sacred vows, your sacrifices, your politics all flattened into one long, titillating headline. Forbidden rites. That's the lasting legacy. Not the truth of what these women and rituals meant, but the scandal people chose to see. And maybe that's the ultimate irony. The most powerful women of the ancient world weren't destroyed by their own actions, but by how others remembered them. They lived as sacred, they died as sacred, but history resurrected them as scandal. And as you sit here, drifting with me through the smoke of these long-forgotten rites, you might realize something unsettling. The scandal never belonged to them. It belonged to us, the outsiders, the interpreters, the storytellers who chose to remember the sacred as shameful because it made a better story. It usually began with the sky and the soil. Ancient people didn't just watch storms water the fields. They saw entire cosmic weddings unfolding above their heads. The rain wasn't rain, it was the god's body visiting the earth, and the crops that sprouted after were their children. What better way to keep the harvests coming than to stage the same drama among humans? A woman, dressed and perfumed as if she were both queen and sacrifice, was chosen to stand in for the earth itself. And some god distant, invisible, but impatient was coaxed into descending for the night. This idea spread like pollen through the ancient world. In Mesopotamia, clay tablets spoke of Inanna and Dumuzi, a goddess and her shepherd consort, whose sacred love affair supposedly renewed the land each spring. The myth wasn't left in storybooks. It was dragged into actual bedrooms. Kings slipped into the role of the shepherd. High priestesses played the goddess, and the act sometimes performed, sometimes mimed, was supposed to bind heaven and earth together in a sticky, ceremonial knot. The community didn't just eat bread, they ate the outcome of that union. It wasn't only about wheat and barley, though these rituals glued power into place. If the rains came and the fields obeyed, the ruler could boast he'd satisfied both heaven and the harvest. If drought struck, people could whisper that maybe the divine marriage had gone cold. Political legitimacy was tied, quite literally, to whether a man could convincingly play lover to the gods. Of course, not every culture used a king for the role. Sometimes the god alone received the woman, with no earthly groom in sight. She was offered not to a mortal partner but to an eternal one, her body marked as belonging to someone whose appetite was imagined to be eternal and dangerously unpredictable. A god doesn't sign contracts or file dowries. His claim on a woman was absolute, and it stretched far beyond her wedding night. The origins of sacred marriage, then, are tangled in myth and mud, part fertility rite, part political theater, part nervous attempt to keep nature from spinning out of control. What looks, on the surface, like a strange little ceremony was actually the scaffolding of early societies, a way to fold chaos back into order. And once a woman was set apart as divine consort, she could never again be merely someone's daughter, or sister, or wife. She was now something more and less. And that leads directly into the question of who, exactly, these women were once chosen. Not queens, not peasants, but a separate category altogether. Priestesses with rings no mortal husband could rival. She wasn't just handed a garland and told she was special. The moment a woman was selected to be a god's bride, she crossed a line that ordinary mortals couldn't step back from. In temple cities across Mesopotamia, she might have been trained from childhood, learning hymns, ritual gestures, the art of stillness, how to carry herself like a vessel, not a person. Once consecrated, her body was essentially absorbed into the temple economy, as inseparable from the sacred precinct as the stone pillars or bronze incense stands. The titles varied, but the function was eerily consistent. She belonged not to a man, nor to her family, but to an unseen partner who didn't tolerate rivals. Unlike a village wife, she wasn't expected to grind grain or haul water. Her duties revolved around tending the god's presence, singing before the statue, pouring wine into bowls, laying out rich meals that were never eaten by human lips. The work was half devotion, half theater, a constant reminder to the community that the divine husband was watching and must be appeased. Socially, her position was paradoxical. On one hand, she was untouchable. No suitor could court her. No husband could drag her into domestic quarrels. On the other hand, she was never free. Her life was mapped out by the temple calendar. Her companions were fellow initiates, and her role was defined entirely by her absence from ordinary life. Some enjoyed wealth, property, and influence, functioning as landowners or administrators. Others were cloistered, their every movement dictated by ritual law. It's easy to imagine awe, but there was also suspicion. A woman said to be married to a god was powerful. Yes, but power always breeds whispers. Was she truly holy, or was she simply locked away for safekeeping? Was she exalted above other women, or denied the very thing that gave them social worth, a family of their own? The ambiguity clung to her robes like incense smoke. Still, she stood at the center of a delicate balancing act, embodying the marriage of mortal and divine. Without her, the god's presence in the city might feel less tangible. With her, the city could claim it was protected, chosen, blessed. She was the hinge between heaven's desire and earth's survival, whether she liked it or not. And when kings entered the scene, things became even murkier, because once rulers stepped into these rituals, the so-called bride of the god was no longer just a servant of the temple. She became a pawn in the marriage between throne and cosmos. When a king appeared in the equation, the ritual marriage turned into something closer to political theater, with a faint scent of incense and sweat. In Mesopotamia, the ceremony of the Hieros Gamos placed the king not as a mere spectator, but as the stand-in for the god himself. The woman, often a high priestess, was prepared as the earthly form of the goddess, her body painted, perfumed, and draped in textiles that shimmered like the night sky. Together they enacted what myths had already scripted, the divine union of god and goddess, with the king's performance meant to echo across the fields, into the soil, and down into the irrigation canals. The symbolism was straightforward but brutal in its stakes. If the crops thrived, the king could claim credit for having pleased the divine partner. If famine struck, doubts crept in. Perhaps the goddess had turned cold. Perhaps the king's performance was lacking. Perhaps heaven itself was reconsidering the political contract. Nothing undermines authority quite like a barren harvest. And so, the king's masculinity, his fertility, and his legitimacy became strangely inseparable. The woman, meanwhile, wasn't a bystander in this drama. She was both stage and script. Her presence validated the king's union with the divine. But her own voice, her own choices, vanished under layers of ritual necessity. She wasn't a bride in any domestic sense. She was a vessel whose consent had been written by myth long before she was born. And still, paradoxically, her role was indispensable. A king could sit on a throne without her, but he couldn't sit in heaven's favor. Other cultures borrowed variations of this cosmic marriage. Among the Hittites, similar rites tied royal bloodlines to divine sanction. In later echoes, you can hear the same logic in coronation oaths, where rulers swore themselves as guardians and partners of gods. Though the bedroom scene had long since been erased, politics has always thrived on theater, and nothing was more theatrical than convincing the entire city that the Pax's survival of their wheat depended on a king's night in bed. Yet, for all the drama, the ritual wasn't always a physical act. Sometimes the union was purely symbolic. Chants, offerings, shared wine, the laying of hands. Whether consummated or not, the effect was the same. A carefully staged illusion where kings, gods, and priestesses all leaned on one another's presence to keep the world from collapsing. And from there, the focus shifts toward the stagecraft itself, the ceremony, the props, the whispered words that made this divine wedding convincing, even when the god remained stubbornly absent. The ceremony itself was a choreography of details. Every gesture rehearsed, every object swollen with meaning. It wasn't just two people in a room. It was an entire community holding its breath outside temple walls, convinced that their survival depended on what unfolded inside. Preparation began days earlier. The chosen woman was washed in scented water, her skin rubbed with oils, her hair combed and bound with ribbons dyed in costly pigments. Gold jewelry was clasped on her wrists and ankles, not as decoration, but as proof of her role as a vessel too precious for ordinary hands. Her garments were layered silks or linen, sometimes sheer enough to suggest vulnerability, sometimes heavy enough to remind everyone that gods don't settle for plain cotton. She was less a bride, and more a canvas painted for divine inspection. The chamber where the rite unfolded was equally staged. A bed carved from cedar or palm stood at the center, draped in embroidered cloth. Bowls of dates, honey, wine, and milk surrounded it, laid out like bait for unseen appetites. Priests chanted hymns outside, their voices rising and falling in hypnotic cadence, as if summoning the god with sound alone. The atmosphere was thick, equal parts theater and dread. You could almost believe that God might actually step down, rustle the curtains, and claim what was his. Whether the rite was consummated varied by time and place. Some accounts insist it was symbolic only. The woman lay beside a statue or effigy, the king drinking wine nearby, the union enacted through words and offerings rather than bodies. Other records, more scandalous, more tantalizing, describe actual intercourse, with priests serving as witnesses to a performance that was less private than it sounds. After all, when fertility of the entire kingdom is on the line, privacy is a luxury. But the most striking detail is how ordinary objects, honey, oil, bread, water, were twisted into symbols of cosmic renewal. A sip of wine became rainfall, a shared bedspread became the land itself, and the woman's body, marked and adorned, became nothing less than the earth awaiting its yearly resurrection. And when the chanting stopped, when the bed curtains fell back into place, the question lingered in the silence: had the god been satisfied, or had the entire rite been a pantomime for human eyes alone? Either way, life had to go on, and the cycle of crops and bodies demanded that the act be repeated again, season after season. From here, the union's meaning spilled outward beyond the chamber, into the fields, and into the fragile balance of rain, soil, and seed. Which brings us to how these marriages weren't just about flesh and ritual, but about food on the table and the eternal gamble of agriculture. The ritual wasn't staged for romance, it was staged for barley, for figs, for the river that might flood too little or too much. Behind all the perfumes, the hymns, and the silk drapery, the sacred marriage was ultimately an agricultural insurance policy. If the god was pleased, the fields would bloom. If not, the people would starve. To ancient eyes, the woman's body was not separate from the soil, it was the soil. Her fertility was a mirror of the land's. Just as the earth cracked open for the rain, she was prepared to receive the god's presence. And just as the crop sprang from the mud, the community believed abundance would spring from her symbolic union. Grain and womb, field and flesh, all blurred into one overwhelming metaphor. Harvest festivals often echoed the wedding night. In some Mesopotamian rites, after the symbolic consummation, loaves of bread and jars of beer were distributed as if they were the tangible fruits of the divine act. The king, smugly seated, could point to the baskets of barley and say, in effect, "Behold, the gods and I have fed you." The woman, however, rarely got to make speeches about her role. She was present in the bread, in the beer, in the whispered fear that without her the earth might have remained barren. Other traditions built the same logic into their seasonal rhythms. In Greek myth, Persephone's descent and return marked the dying and rebirth of crops. In India, goddesses linked to rivers and fertility were offered brides from among the living to ensure monsoons stayed loyal. Even in Mesoamerica, young women were sometimes given as ritual wives to gods before being sacrificed, their bodies folded into the logic of rain and maize. Always the same exchange, a woman for a harvest, a marriage for survival. It wasn't sentimental, but it was binding. The entire community ate the outcome, drank it, relied on it. And year after year, the ritual was renewed, not because people enjoyed it, but because hunger has always been persuasive. Still, while the harvests fattened some, the lives of the divine brides themselves often shrank into narrow corridors of service. For them, being tied to the cycles of earth meant losing the cycles of family, freedom, and choice. Which leads to the quiet toll exacted on the women themselves, the cost of being sacred. For the woman at the center of it all, sacred service was rarely a blessing without a shadow. Once she was named a bride of the god, her life ceased to belong to herself. She could no longer marry, bear children in the ordinary way, or walk into a market without carrying the invisible weight of being someone else's property, not her father's, not her husband's, but a deity's. And gods, as history shows, make demanding spouses. Family ties were often severed or thinned. The bride might be cloistered within temple walls, living among other consecrated women. Her daily life narrowed to rituals, songs, offerings, and silence. The sound of laughter at a wedding feast, or the ordinary chaos of children, drifted past her like echoes from a world she could not re-enter. Some gained wealth, landholdings, servants, stipends funded by temple estates. They could wield real influence as administrators, landlords, even judges. But wealth is cold comfort when one's body is pledged eternally to an absent husband who never loosens his grip. The irony was hard to miss. In many cultures, women outside the temple were defined almost exclusively by their marriages. Wife of so-and-so, mother of so-and-so. Inside the temple, a divine bride was both more and less. She carried authority, but her name was overshadowed by the gods. She had protection, but also surveillance. She was untouchable, but also untouchably alone. And not all accounts suggest comfort. Some traditions, particularly in later echoes of the practice, placed these women closer to confinement than exaltation. The Devadasi system in India, once conceived as dedication to gods and temples, shifted under social and economic pressures into something much harsher, binding women to lives where their sacred role blurred dangerously with exploitation. In every case, the cost of being chosen was that the choice had not been theirs. The balance between reverence and restriction hung constantly over their heads. They were praised in hymns, yet locked in routines. They were necessary for society's survival, yet denied the ordinary survival of kinship and family. Sacred service gave them power over rituals, but at the expense of power over themselves. And in that tension between exaltation and captivity, you glimpse the deeper politics of gender in these marriages. Because the ritual wasn't only about gods and soil, it was also about who controlled women, and what counted as their worth. The sacred marriage always looked splendid in hymns and festival processions. But beneath the perfume and poetry lay a blunt truth. It was a system for organizing power, and women's bodies were the scaffolding. By offering a woman to a god, societies weren't just feeding the fields or flattering the heavens. They were locking female sexuality inside a vault and throwing away the key, handing it to priests, kings, and myths. On the surface, the consecrated bride was revered. She stood closer to the divine than any ordinary wife could dream. She poured wine for statues that others dared not touch. She walked in ceremonies that crowned kings. Yet the reverence was doubled. Her status was elevated only because her choices were erased. To be sacred meant to be unavailable. To be powerful meant to be supervised. The paradox was baked into the very architecture of temples, towering walls that proclaimed glory from the outside while enclosing silence within. Control of sexuality was central. Ordinary women were tethered to households, where reproduction ensured heirs and laborers. The sacred bride was tethered to eternity, her fertility redirected from family lineage to cosmic order. Either way, men decided the terms. Kings claimed legitimacy through her. Priests guarded access to her. Entire cities measured their fortune through her supposed intimacy with an unseen partner. She embodied abundance, but could not decide what to do with it. And yet, these women were not simply victims. Some manipulated their position shrewdly, building influence, commanding wealth, even shaping politics through whispers in temple corridors. A god's bride might have no husband, but she could have allies, petitioners, clients, all seeking favors from someone who stood at the threshold between heaven and earth. Still, even their power circled back to the same cruel irony: authority granted on the condition of subordination. Gender, in this context, wasn't just biology, it was a script written by ritual. Women were indispensable, but their indispensability came prepackaged with limits. They were elevated, but only in roles defined by others. It's an old story, one that repeats across cultures, each writing its own version of how a woman's body could be borrowed to stabilize the cosmos. And those variations are where the picture broadens: different lands, different names, different costumes, but the same haunting logic. The sacred marriage wasn't confined to one river valley or one pantheon. It wandered across continents, shedding and gaining shapes like a ritual chameleon. In Mesopotamia, the Hieros Gamos was staged with solemn chants and perfumed chambers, a union between priestess and king, echoing the romance of Inanna and Dumuzi. Across the Mediterranean, and Greek priestesses were ceremonially married to gods like Dionysus, slipping into roles that blurred theater, worship, and civic duty. No one really thought Dionysus turned up to sign the marriage register, but the ritual kept his presence anchored in the city. Farther east, the Devadasi tradition in India bound women to temples as brides of deities, their service spanning dance, music, and ritual devotion. For centuries, these women embodied the link between human community and divine favor until the system was warped by shifting economies and colonial reinterpretations, which reduced sacred service to something far more transactional and brutal. Across the Atlantic, in the empires of Mesoamerica, the logic grew sharper, almost crueler. Maidens were selected, adorned as brides of gods, fated in processions, then sacrificed, their deaths sealing the divine marriage with blood. The marriage bed, in this case, was the sacrificial stone. To modernize, it looks savage, but to those who watched Rain's return after the rites, it was reassurance that their gods had indeed accepted the offer. Even the Abrahamic world didn't entirely sever ties with the idea. Medieval nuns took vows as brides of Christ, symbolically wed to a husband who demanded celibacy, obedience, and devotion. No king slipped into their chambers, no crops depended on their union. But the framework was hauntingly familiar. A woman offered to a god, her life reordered around a marriage that was more metaphor than partnership. In every case, the costumes and liturgies changed, but the underlying equations stayed stable. society demanded a woman stand in as partner to the divine, her body or her vows marking the boundary between the ordinary and the eternal. And when her earthly service ended, the question remained, what became of these brides once their ritual role was spent? Were they laid to rest as honored figures, or did their stories dissolve into silence? Death didn't always release the god's bride from her vows. In some traditions, her burial was as carefully orchestrated as her consecration, staged to keep the union intact beyond the grave. Archaeologists digging in Mesopotamian temple precincts have uncovered tombs where consecrated women lay interred inside sacred walls, sealed in stone chambers that turned the temple itself into both husband and mausoleum. To the living, it meant the god still kept his wife close, even in death. Legends grew around these women, especially those who'd once carried influence. Some were remembered as oracles, their voices preserved in ritual texts long after their bodies turned to dust. Others blurred into myth, said to linger as spirits that still haunted temple corridors. A consecrated woman was rarely allowed to fade into anonymity. Even in whispers, she was marked as different, a figure caught between human memory and divine possession. There were darker fates too. In cultures where ritual brides were offered in sacrifice, their afterlife was imagined not in tombs but in transformations, maidens becoming stars, rivers, or flowers. Their deaths retold as acts of cosmic renewal. The Aztec girl married to Tezcatlipoca, for instance, lived a year in luxury before being killed. Her body offered to keep the world turning. Her afterlife wasn't domestic bliss but divine absorption, her individuality erased in exchange for eternal cosmic presence. Even in later traditions, echoes of the same logic lingered. Nuns who called themselves brides of Christ were buried in convent cemeteries, their vows carried beyond life itself. In some places, they were laid in bridal garments, veils intact, as though their marriage contract had only just begun. The symbolism was unmistakable. Their husband might be invisible, but he remained possessive. So the afterlife of ritual brides rarely belonged to them. Whether laid in temples, remembered in myths, or dressed in veils underground, they continued to serve the gods they'd been given to. Death, in their case, wasn't a release but a continuation. And yet, nothing lasts forever. Not temples, not dynasties, not rituals. The practice of marrying women to gods eventually eroded, transformed, or was outlawed, leaving only fragments, echoes, and symbolic substitutes. Ritual marriages, like all grand inventions of the ancient world, eventually crumbled under the weight of time. Temples fell, dynasties broke, new religions marched in with sharper creeds. What had once been an unquestioned pact between gods and women became either superstition to be erased or symbolism to be absorbed and rebranded. Colonial encounters accelerated the unraveling. In India, the British declared the Devadasi system immoral, outlawing it while conveniently ignoring that the same system had been bent into exploitation, partly by colonial economics in the first place. In Mesoamerica, Spanish conquerors stamped out the sacrificial marriages, calling them barbaric, while staging their own spectacles of conquest in churches built on temple ruins. In the Near East, the decline of city-states meant the end of sacred unions between kings and priestesses. The gods no longer had palaces to dwell in, so their brides were left without husbands. Yet the logic never disappeared entirely. Christianity gave the world the figure of the nun as the bride of Christ, a woman cloistered, veiled, married not to a man but to eternity. The ring placed on her finger, the veil over her head, the vow spoken aloud, these were unmistakable descendants of the ancient sacred marriage. Stripped of fertility rites but heavy with the same claim, that her life, her body, her identity, belonged to someone divine and unseen. The transformation softened some of the harsher edges. No more sacrificial stones, no more kings proving their virility in candlelit chambers. But the structure lingered, the offering of a woman as a stabilizing force between human society and divine will. Even today, fragments of the ritual flicker weddings, staged as cosmic unions. Veils and rings, loaded with symbolism far older than churches admit. Whispers of vows that echo the language of being chosen, bound, absorbed. What was once a harvest spell has become metaphor. What was once a political contract has become devotion. And yet the traces remain clear enough that, if you squint at a nun's white veil, or a bride's vow to love till death do us part, you can almost see the shadow of ancient temples, hear the chants, smell the incense, and remember the women once given to gods in marriages that were never theirs to choose. In some corners of the ancient world, desire wasn't a guilty pleasure, nor a private indulgence whispered about behind shutters. It was a civic responsibility. The act of longing, of touching, entering, yielding was less about individual appetite and more about keeping the cosmos turning. To abstain wasn't virtuous, it was negligent. Whole cities, from the river-fed plains of Mesopotamia to the sunburnt coasts of the Aegean, imagined that without ritualized intimacy, the heavens themselves might withhold their favor. The rain wouldn't come, the grain would sour, the womb would stay stubbornly empty. A glance at the clay tablets of Sumer shows this logic spelled out in a tone both bureaucratic and ecstatic. Kings were expected to unite with high priestesses in the name of Inanna, the goddess who embodied fertility and fierce, devouring desire. This wasn't romance in any recognizable sense. It was agriculture written into flesh, politics poured into a bed. A ruler who failed to perform was a liability. A city's entire prosperity rested on whether a body could sweat convincingly under ritual sheets. The paradox is unsettling. While later ages would fasten chains around lust, here it was tethered only by obligation. Even hesitation could feel like heresy. The act of release wasn't personal relief, was an offering, an oblation, a kind of sacrament written into sinew. Every sigh, every trembling motion carried the weight of a harvest. What we tend to file away as private passion was, for them, a form of cosmic maintenance. Of course, once bodies became vessels of obligation, they ceased being burdens of flesh. They turned into instruments, sacred ones, polished not for abstinence but for use. And if bodies were instruments, they could be played, displayed, and dedicated in ways that still echo in the margins of history. The body, in these old cosmologies, wasn't treated as a sack of temptation to be starved into obedience. It was closer to an altar-skin muscle, and breath arranged for service. To withhold it was to deny the gods their rightful due, because the divine had a particular appetite, not for hymns alone, but for sweat, groans, and the unsteady rhythm of pulse against pulse. Desire was the language, and the body was expected to be fluent. Take the cults that blurred lines between offering and act. Fertility festivals across the Mediterranean often required whole communities to reenact myths of passion. A pair chosen from among them, sometimes a priestess, sometimes an ordinary woman pulled suddenly into the rollwood, embodied divine figures through ritual intimacy. The others looked on, not with prurience but with relief. The gods had been fed, the balance restored. What we would call performance was, for them, a direct deposit into the cosmic bank account. The body in this frame wasn't disposable, nor was it private. Its curves, its fluids, its ability to tremble, these were assets of the state, of the fields, of the temple walls painted with the scent of incense. To be desired wasn't scandalous, it was necessary. To yield wasn't humiliation, it was collaboration. The mechanics of flesh were as sacred as the grindstone or the plow. Both tools pressed into service to guarantee continuity. And once the body was recast as an offering, the spaces where these obligations played out also shifted. Temples doubled as bedrooms, altars became stages, and the divine was imagined to be watching, listening, maybe even leaning in to inhale. Which brings us, inevitably, into the strange corridors where sacred stone and warm flesh met. Step inside a Mesopotamian ziggurat or a Greek sanctuary at the right season, and the line between worship and embrace blurs until it vanishes. The temple, with its carved lintels and heavy incense, wasn't simply a place for hymns or offerings of grain. It was, quite literally, a bedchamber where gods and mortals were thought to share a night. Stone walls became witnesses to acts, carried out not in secret but under divine inspection, each touch echoing louder than any chant. In Tisumirian Yeros Gamost, the sacred marriage, a king took the role of Dumuzi, a shepherd god, while the high priestess became Inanna, goddess of love and war. Their union was staged with solemn ritual and extravagant feasting. But at its core was an act of intimacy that fused statecraft with longing. The king's legitimacy didn't come from armies or taxes alone. It was ratified in sheets perfumed with oil and wine, while attendants hummed prayers outside. Desire here was a legal document, stamped with sweat. Elsewhere, across the Mediterranean, Aphrodite's temples carried similar undertones. Women and men tied to the temple lived as consorts to the goddess, embodying her appetite. Their role wasn't reducible to commerce, as later moralists would sneer. It was a vocation, a kind of spiritual craftsmanship, where every gesture was believed to ripple into the realm of the divine. The architecture itself encouraged this reading. Inner chambers dimly lit, perfumed air thick with resins, and polished stones warmed by bodies leaning against them. These spaces were not only consecrated, but choreographed, built to absorb size as easily as chance. Desire carved itself into the very foundations, sanctifying stone with the memory of skin. But temples weren't only theaters of ritual unions, they were also insurance policies for survival, where what happened in the dark corners was said to keep the rains coming, the animals fertile, the people fed, and that collective anxiety, the fear of hunger, of barren soil, turned personal longing into communal duty, which leads straight into the next layer of this obligation. Fertility not as romance, but as cosmic insurance. For ancient communities, desire wasn't framed in whispers of passion, but in the blunt language of survival. A barren year could mean death by hunger. A womb that refused to swell was as ominous as a sky that refused to rain. So fertility became more than a private concern, it was public infrastructure, as essential as irrigation, canals or granaries. And if crops were fed by rain, then rain, people believed, was fed by ritual desire. Agricultural calendars often pulsed in rhythm with festivals of ecstatic union. At planting, couples or sometimes entire groups were urged to imitate the joining of gods and goddesses, their acts echoing across fields like sympathetic magic. As above, so below, but with a decidedly earthy twist. If the soil was to open itself, so too must the bodies of those who worked it. Intimacy wasn't indulgence. It was a plow driven into the invisible furrows of the cosmos. Take Babylon, where New Year festivals placed fertility at the center of civic ritual. The king and high priestess enacted sacred union to guarantee the prosperity of the realm. Their coupling wasn't viewed as optional or symbolic. It was necessary to keep the Tigris flooding and the barley rising. To neglect desire was to gamble with famine. Even outside temples, echoes of this duty-shaped village life. In some communities, newlyweds were expected to spend their first night not privately but with neighbors hovering outside, waiting for signs that the couple had fulfilled their role. It was less about voyeurism than communal relief. One more thread woven into the web of survival, and so desire became inseparable from crops, harvests, livestock. To hunger was to remember that someone, somewhere, had not given enough of themselves to the gods, which is why passion, trembling and ecstatic, was treated not as shame but as obligation, an obligation that could tilt into something more transcendent when the body's fever became indistinguishable from spiritual ecstasy. When desire crossed the threshold from flesh into frenzy, it was no longer just a duty, it was a doorway. Ecstasy, in the ancient sense, meant stepping out of the self, leaving the ordinary body behind like a shed husk. And the quickest route to that threshold wasn't always fasting or chanting. Sometimes it was the body convulsing under waves of pleasure, the mind loosened until the gods could slip in unnoticed. Anthropologists note that trance states, whether induced by drumming, dancing, or feverish intimacy, share the same physiological tremors, irregular breath, racing pulse, limbs trembling as if seized. In some temples, these very symptoms were cultivated deliberately. To feel your body falter wasn't weakness. It was proof the divine had arrived. A shudder could be a visitation, a climax, a possession. The rites of Dionysus in Greece embodied this duality perfectly. Wine, music, and ecstatic release pulled people beyond themselves, dissolving boundaries between mortal and immortal. To join the frenzy wasn't debauchery, at least not in its original register. It was a civic sacrament. A person's cries, whether of pleasure or of pain, became indistinguishable from prayer. Elsewhere, in India, tantric practices reframed erotic union as the merging of cosmic principles, male and female, Shiva and Shakti, energy and stillness. Here, desire became a staircase to enlightenment, each embrace a rung closer to dissolving the illusion of separation. To resist was to stay trapped in the mundane. To yield was to dissolve into the eternal. What later theologians would condemn as dangerous excess was, in these contexts, spiritual discipline. Ecstasy wasn't an accident. It was cultivated, expected, recorded in hymns and carved into temple walls. Flesh carried spirit the way a river carries boats, whether the current was calm or roaring. But ecstasy didn't always belong to the anonymous crowd. Sometimes it was entrusted to a chosen few, individuals bound for life to live as vessels of desire, and not for themselves, but for the gods they served. Which brings us to the unsettling vocation of those who became divine consorts, such as the Devadasi. Not every obligation to desire was spread across a village or staged for a king. In some traditions, it was condensed into a single life-fan, individual chosen, or more often offered, to embody divine longing permanently. These were the ones who didn't just visit ecstasy during festivals. They were expected to live inside it, day after day, as if the gods had taken them for spouses. In southern India, the figure of the Devadasi reveals this paradox with startling clarity. Dedicated to a deity, often before puberty, she was bound not to a husband of flesh but to the god enshrined in the temple. Her jewelry, her anklets, even the red streak painted in her hairline marked her as married not to a man, but to divinity itself. She sang, danced, and yes, sometimes served physically, all as part of her role as the deity's consort. Desire here wasn't private or optional. It was liturgical, woven into daily offerings of movement and touch. To an outsider, it might look like subjugation. Yet in the cosmology of the time, these women weren't degraded but exalted. Their bodies became ritual instruments, their intimacy transformed into a form of sacred currency. The Devadasi's embrace was said to channel the god's own appetite, ensuring prosperity for the community. She lived in a paradox, exalted as divine spouse, yet anchored by human vulnerability. And it wasn't just in India. In Mesopotamia, priestesses of Ishtar bore similar roles, their lives defined by the union between mortal and divine. Even in early Christian texts, echoes of this arrangement survive in the language of the Bride of Christ. Though stripped of the physical and recast into ascetic metaphor, the logic remained consistent. Some bodies weren't theirs to own. They had been signed over, contracted to gods who demanded not silence but surrender. Every breath, every step across temple stones, was shaped by this covenant of longing. And kings, too, were not exempt. Their authority, their right to rule, often rested on whether they could perform. Similar unions acts where the line between politics and passion blurred beyond recognition. Desire, in these contexts, wasn't merely sacred. It was a weapon, a seal, a battlefield all its own. For rulers, desire wasn't a private luxury tucked away behind palace curtains. It was a tool of statecraft, sharpened and polished until it gleamed like a sword. Kings were not only expected to conquer lands but also to conquer in bed, their bodies performing ceremonies that stitched legitimacy into the fabric of their reigns. The bedchamber became an extension of the throne room. The sheets carried as much political weight as the royal seal. In Mesopotamia, the hieros gamos, staged between king and high priestess, was more than a ritual. It was a performance of authority. The king's virility translated into fertile soil and loyal subjects. If he faltered, the harvest might too, and whispers of weakness could unravel dynasties faster than any invading army. Desire here was weaponized, a public spectacle hidden behind closed doors, yet spoken of openly in hymns and court poetry. The Greeks and Romans understood the same principle, though they dressed it differently. Alexander the Great claimed descent from gods, and his supposed unions with priestesses or sacred figures bolstered that claim. Later, emperors surrounded themselves with divine mistresses or celestial consorts. The unspoken message clear: political power flowed from the same source as erotic potency. To command in war, one had to command in passion. Even outside the palaces, warriors marched into battle under banners of fertility and desire. Dionysian theazoi, wild processions of women in ecstatic trance, paralleled the frenzy of war, blurring the line between the charge of bodies in union and the clash of bodies in combat. Both were acts of surrender and domination. Both demanded blood, sweat, and abandon. But history is rarely kind to such entanglements. As new moral orders took root, this seamless blend of power and passion began to crack. What was once celebrated as sacred obligation started to be rebranded as dangerous excess, indulgence, even sin. And so desire, once the spine of legitimacy, found itself on trial in the court of morality. The pendulum eventually swung. What had been sacred obligation, touch, sigh, ecstasy, was recast in harsher centuries as weakness, temptation, even poison. The body that once carried fields and dynasties on its hips suddenly became suspect, a liability to be policed rather than celebrated. Desire, formerly a civic duty, was now whispered about like contraband. In late antiquity, early Christian writers set about dismantling the old equations. Where Mesopotamians saw harvests in a king's embrace, bishops saw corruption. The temple consort was no longer a priestess but a prostitute, her rituals rewritten as scandals. Festivals of fertility were recoded as debauchery, with their sacred logic scrubbed clean. The moral panic was less about erasing desire than about seizing control of it, reshaping it into a private, guilty secret rather than a public, holy performance. Augustine, for example, placed lust in the category of original sin, the flesh trembling not as divine visitation but as proof of fallenness. A shudder became evidence of corruption, not communion. By the medieval period, the same shudder was grounds for penance, cloisters, or firewood stacked high in the square. The cosmic ledger had been rewritten. Desire no longer paid the gods, it owed a debt to the devil. And yet, the panic never quite erased the older echoes. Carnival still bloomed on church calendars, disguised as harmless festivity. The maypole thrust itself into village squares, spinning ancient fertility into Christian springtime. Even as the moralists preached abstinence, their congregations danced around symbols older than Scripture. So desire was driven underground, stripped of its crown, forced into the cellar of conscience. But like wine fermenting in a sealed jar, it refused to vanish. It simply seeped into new disguises, hidden in festivals, ceremonies, and customs too stubborn to die. Which brings us to those half-lit survivals where ancient obligations lingered beneath the mask of celebration. Even when moral orders thundered against it, desire had a way of sneaking back into ritual. Wrapped in disguises so ordinary they almost escaped notice, old obligations, stripped of their temples, crept into festivals, songs, and seasonal rites, half remembered but stubbornly alive. A village might not speak of sacred unions anymore, but they would still raise a maypole, its tall shaft dressed with ribbons, its circle of dancers weaving fertility into the soil with each step. Carnival, too, carried whispers of the older world. Behind the masks and painted faces lay echoes of rites where inhibition was briefly suspended, and bodies moved in ways that moral codes otherwise forbade. For a few days, flesh returned to its cosmic role, laughing, sweating, colliding, insisting that survival required more than prayer alone. The church tolerated it grudgingly, labeling it misrule or harmless excess. But the deeper logic persisted. The cycle of life demanded a season where desire stepped back into daylight. Marriage ceremonies also bore the imprint of these continuities. The lifting of a veil, the scattering of rice, the insistence on consummation, all were ritual fragments older than the altars where they were performed. Even the bawdy songs sung at weddings, often too indecent for polite record, carried forward a memory that unions weren't just about two souls, but about renewing the community's contract with fertility and continuity. The irony is that even as theologians tightened their grip, daily life refused to give up its small rebellions. A harvest dance, a bawdy joke, a night of misrule were reminders that desire couldn't be locked away without consequence. What had once been declared an obligation lingered as habit, survival, instinct, or sheer cultural muscle memory. But habits fade, and as centuries rolled forward, the older obligations dimmed. Desire became less about gods and fields, and more about individuals, about private appetites, guilty pleasures, personal choices. The divine no longer demanded trembling bodies in its name. And that raises the final quiet question: what happens when the gods stop needing you? Once the gods loosened their grip on the sheets, desire was left adrift, stripped of its cosmic urgency. No more kings trembling under the eyes of priestesses, no more rainstorms guaranteed by ritual embraces. Instead, longing became something small, privatized, carried out behind doors that had no celestial audience. What was once considered the hinge of the universe was rebranded as indulgence, romance, sin, or simply biology. The Enlightenment treated desire like a curiosity for physicians to catalogue rather than priests to bless. By the Victorian era, the body had been bound in lace, corsets, and etiquette, its tremors relegated to fainting couches or whispered scandals. No harvest was believed to hang on the outcome. No temple trembled at the sound. The gods, it seemed, had officially stopped needing us for this particular task. Yet the silence feels deceptive. Festivals still bloom with erotic undertones, from Mardi Gras beads to fertility mascots grinning at Easter. Advertising seizes the role once played by priests, insisting that longing fuels economies now, not crops. Desire hasn't vanished, that's merely shifted employers. From the divine to the commercial, from cosmic balance to market demand, the obligation remains, but its altar has changed. And still, in some corners, echoes persist. In rural rites, in whispers of sacred union, in the stubborn rhythm of songs older than scripture, one can sense the ghost of that older world, when longing was larger than the self, when bodies weren't just private playgrounds, but bridges between heaven and earth. The gods may no longer need us, but perhaps we still need them more, at least the memory of a time when desire wasn't hidden, wasn't trivial, but carried the weight of survival, legitimacy, and eternity itself. And that memory, faint but persistent, lingers like incense long after the temple has burned down.